Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that you are choosing to invest some of your day in learning with us. I'm your host, Becky Robinson. I'm here today with Dr. Steven Stein. Steve, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Great to be with you and happy spring.
Yes, it's a little bit cold here today, but I am definitely anticipating spring. We would love to know how things are in the world where you are. And so as you're coming into the webinar today, we would love to have you take a moment to say hello to us in the chat. Let us know where you are in the US or around the world calling in from today. We'd love to give you a shout out. And in fact, if you happen to be calling in as a part of your professional development and you are representing your organization, we would love to hear what organization you are representing, and I will do my best to shout you out as well. So it looks like we have an international audience already with a caller from Stockholm, Sweden, LA, Lubbock, Texas, Rome, Italy, Dayton, Ohio, Denver, Colorado, representing a probation office there, outside of Baltimore, sunny and 62 in St. Petersburg, Bonn, Germany, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Bridget from the National Weather Service, welcome to you. Judith representing Northeast Wisconsin Technical College. Wow. So callers from all over, just browsing quickly. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage in the chat. And we would welcome you throughout today's event. If you have any questions or comments or would like to interact with one another, we would welcome you to engage in the chat with each other. Just also a quick shout out to Tom Horn from Chicago. He's with the Full Picture Coaching Organization. So thanks to those of you who are taking the time to share with us about yourselves. I want to take a quick moment to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Steven Stein. He is a world-renowned clinical psychologist, international best-selling author and sought-after speaker, and the founder and executive chair of Multi-Health Systems, which is known as MHS, a publisher of scientifically validated assessments for over 40 years. And Steve, you are based in Toronto, Canada, is that right?
That's absolutely right.
So Steve has done some amazing work in the world with top corporations, as he has been a world cutting edge leading expert on psychological assessment and emotional intelligence. So let me tell you some of the organizations he's worked with, including the Canadian Forces, the US Air Force, the Army, the Navy, special units of the Pentagon, the FBI Academy, American Express, Air Canada, Coca-Cola Mexico, among many others. But probably the most interesting work that Dr. Steven Stein does is his work with reality TV shows. So Steve, could you tell us about some of the shows on which you've consulted?
Wow, there's dozens and dozens. So everything from Big Brother Canada, The Amazing Race Canada, Master Chef, Scare Tactics, Blown Away, on and on and on. Dozens and dozens of reality shows.
Amazing. I used to be a reality show junkie, so maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that later. Today, we are focusing primarily on two of Dr. Stein's books, Hardiness, Making Stress Work for You to Achieve Your Life Goals, and Emotional Intelligence for Dummies. And he has also authored several other books, but the most recent edition of Emotional Intelligence for Dummies launched in April of 2023. So as we get started today, we want to get to know a little bit about you. And so I have some polls that we are going to ask you to answer so that we can get to know a bit more about you. So first, we'd like to know, how familiar are you with the concept of emotional intelligence? Are you unaware? Have you had some training? Have you read some articles and books? Or do you consider yourself very familiar with this topic? And thank you for taking the time to answer the poll. Looking forward to sharing your feedback in just a moment. Okay, let's take a look. It looks like about half of you are very familiar with emotional intelligence. About a third of you have read some articles and books, and about 16% of you have had some training. Not a person on the call today saying that they are unaware of the concept of emotional intelligence. So our second poll is related to the concept of hardiness, and we would love to have your feedback on that. As it relates to hardiness, we would like to know, how familiar are you with the concept of hardiness? Are you unaware? Have you had some training? Have you read some articles and books? Or are you an expert? I know we have at least one expert on hardiness on this call. Right, Steve?
I hope so.
Yes, I think so. So we'll give you a moment to answer the poll, and we will share that with you in just a moment. Thank you for choosing to participate with the poll. I love seeing your feedback. So of our attendees today who have answered the poll, it looks like 45% are unaware of the topic of hardiness. So this is a brand new topic that we have the chance to explore together. 9% of you have had some training. 41% have read some articles and books. And if you happen to read Hardiness, Dr. Stein's book, I'd love to know that in the chat. And 3 of you say that you are experts on hardiness. So we look forward to your questions and interaction today. So thank you so much for being with us. At this time, Steve, I know you have some remarks to share with those who are with us about the background of these 2 books and why you wrote them. And then I'll be coming back for some great conversation with you a little later in the session.
Great. Thanks, Becky. Yeah, I guess I was asked to say a few words about what led to these 2 books and maybe to some degree what they have in common or why they go together. And I'll start with the journey, which is pretty much an uncharted journey. Uh, as a number of you know who know me, I started out as a regular psychologist working with children and youth and their families at a large mental health center. And in those early days, part of what we did in treating these kids, and some of them were having a lot of real serious challenges, we had to do assessments. We had to get to know what the nature of their issues or problems were. And it was pretty challenging with some of these kids to get them to do what many psychologists do, is administer psychological tests. So what that led to was automating the test. And these are the days, we're talking about 40 years ago, the days where the Apple computer was a brand new thing. These 2 guys named Steve Jobs and Wozniak had just invented this thing called an Apple II. So I had the idea of putting some of the questions for these kids on a computer. And lo and behold, they got really excited. And suddenly I started getting all kinds of information from the kids I was working with. In fact, we discovered things that clinicians didn't know, things about sexual abuse, about drug use, and about a whole variety of sensitive topics. So this got me into the area of assessment. And what that meant was when we do assessments is we really get moved towards the area of research, learning more about people, collecting information in objective ways. So that was kind of the next part of my journey. And a lot of the work to that point was working with kids and to some degree parents and other adults who were experiencing various problems such as attention deficit disorder, depression, anxiety, a lot of the problems that are very typical or usual for psychologists to work with. But then suddenly in the very early 1990s, it dawned on me that, we spend so much time working out and trying to learn what's wrong with people. Wouldn't it be interesting to try and find out what's right with people? And what I mean with that is I started getting interested in people who perform really well in our society, perform at really high levels. We talk about people like athletes, we talk about entertainers, performers, people who seem to be successful, CEOs who are doing well, and so on. So I kind of changed the focus of the work I was doing. And there was a new movement that was just about to begin called positive psychology. But at the time, the idea of emotional intelligence was really unheard of. It's great to see among you that so many of you on this call are familiar with emotional intelligence. When I started talking about this about 25 or so years ago, it was completely unknown. People thought I was crazy. They would say things like, how can you be emotional and intelligent? They're two opposite things. So it was really pioneering those early days with Peter Salovey, Jack Mayer, Reuven Bar-On, the people who kind of originated this concept. And of course, once it got picked up by Dan Goleman's book, it sort of exploded and became better known, but of course, not as well known as it is today. So I shifted in that area, and we've been doing research on emotional intelligence and lecturing and work and all kinds of things for the last 25 or so years. And we've learned a lot and get to discuss some of that. But along the way, even with understanding people who are high in emotional intelligence, there was still a bit of a gap. And some of that had to do with dealing with the stress in their lives. And fortunately, I was at a meeting at it was actually the American Psychological Association meeting a number of years ago when I met my colleague Paul Bartone. Paul had just retired from the U.S. Army. He was a colonel. He was the actually the senior psychologist in the U.S. Army, and he had been doing research at that point for over 20 years in this idea called hardiness. And so a lot of the research that had been done at that point was kind of restricted within the military, within obscure scientific journals. It wasn't really well known. So Paul and I started working together, and I thought, wow, this is really important work. Some of his research was done at West Point, studying successful leaders and looking at combat soldiers and veterans, and a lot of the work that was done was really applicable to the corporate environment, and that's where my role came in. We worked together to write this book, Hardiness, and really bring the ideas and the research and some of the work that we've been doing, the techniques of hardiness, to a broader audience, bringing it out to a more corporate audience. And this kind of filled a bit of a gap. And we'll talk a bit about the relationship as we go in terms of emotional intelligence and hardiness and how these concepts fit together. But it sort of filled a bit of that gap when it comes to managing stress and how do people successfully do that. And again, going back to and when I said it, I studied what makes things go well for people, what makes them go right. When we started our work in emotional intelligence, my goal was to study the full spectrum of human behavior. So in my earlier books, I wrote about people who are unemployed that we studied. We studied homeless people. We studied people with severe bouts of cancer. We studied people who were struggling in their lives from a variety of different directions, as well as the high performers. So again, it was looking at what could we find? What were some of the gaps? Even people who were homeless, we found some of them were more successful in dealing with their situation than others were. People dealing with serious medical problems. There's a range in our ability to deal with these issues. And even in the high performers, if we look at professionals, we looked at physicians and lawyers. And as we all know, and this is what differentiated from IQ. Yeah, you need a certain level of IQ to become a physician or a lawyer, to get a medical school, law school. But even with that high level of IQ or intelligence, we know there's a whole range of performance. We know that there are physicians who are great and do wonderful work, but there are also physicians who lose their license, who do terrible things with what they have. And we've seen the same thing with lawyers, that there are some phenomenal lawyers. I used to profile lawyers for a legal magazine where we would test emotional intelligence of some of the what were ranked as the highest performing lawyers in Canada. And we also know there are many lawyers who get disbarred, who do awful things, who steal from their clients and so on. So IQ wasn't enough to explain everything that was going on with people. So that was really important in our work in emotional intelligence, EQ, differentiating people, whether they have high IQs, low IQs, average IQs, and applying this work to as broad an audience as possible, to a wide range of people. So that kind of that's kind of the uncharted journey in a nutshell that got me from being a regular line psychologist in a facility to moving forward in my career and life. And along the way, I started a company called MHS because the assessment led me into that. And we now are pretty large. My wife and I started in our basement, two of us when we had our first child. And now we have about 200 employees. So I guess you could say we were pretty successful in the work we've been doing. And we apply these concepts like emotional intelligence, hardiness, the concepts that we talk about and we study, we apply them in our own workforce. So I think from there, I'm going to give it back to you, Becky, to carry on.
Well, I'm really interested in diving in a bit more on this topic of hardiness, and there are some questions that have been coming in the chat as well. But I'd love to start with an overview of hardiness, because there are these three facets that you talk about in the book that make up hardiness: commitment, control, and challenge. So why don't we start with an overview of those three?
Okay, so those are the basis of hardiness, what it's about. Um, and these three C's, these three areas, after again a lot of research, dozens and dozens, maybe over a couple hundred studies, have sort of validated the importance of these three C's in people who successfully not just deal with stress, but become even stronger after going through stressful experience. So the first C that we talk about is challenge. And what that involves is when things come across your path in life, things are difficult, you're going through a stressful situation. There's a couple ways we can deal with it. We can get bogged down and worry and just do nothing about it, or we can sort of step back and look at it and say, you know what, this is not a good situation. So we face the situation, but we say, but I think there's a way out of it. And we almost treat it like a puzzle, as an opportunity, as a way to find a new pathway in life, or some new way to handle a situation. So challenge is a mindset. We refer to these as mindsets because it's a sort of a deep way of thinking and approaching the world, where you say that, I think I can overcome that, and I'm going to find the best way to do that. The second C we talk about is control. And what we found is that people who are successful at dealing with these situations, they're quickly able to differentiate the things in life that I can control versus those that I can't. For example, working with high level professional tennis players, they're going into a match. They have no control over the weather. It could be windy. They have no control over their opponent, and their opponent could be nasty, could be dissing them. All kinds of things can go wrong. But what we found is that the really strong athletes in this case were able to differentiate the fact that, okay, I can't control the weather, but I can control the way that I serve. I can control the way that I stand. I can control when I rush the net and when I stay back. So there are a whole bunch of things in the world, in their world, that they can control, and that's what they focus on. And they don't waste time trying to change things that are out of their control, like the climate or the weather. And the third one is commitment. And this one also was really important. So we all have things, or hopefully we all have things in life that drive us, that we're excited about. Some people are driven by, I don't know, their religious beliefs, or by spirituality, or by other things in their life that help them overcome difficulties. And we find that it's really important to have some overriding goal in your life that is going to drive you forward, even when times are difficult. You look to these what we call commitment, to this thing that you want to see in your future, and use that to help take you forward.
Those are so powerful, Steve, but I would love to dig in a little bit deeper on this topic of control, because there are times in our life where, we might feel out of control when we face certain challenges. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions for us about how we might be able to shift our mindsets to feel more in control of our lives when everything feels exceedingly chaotic.
Well, again, it's really kind of differentiating. I mean, this research started with a group of executives that were being studied through the University of Chicago. And what happened in the middle of the study, where they were looking at stress in executives, is a lot of these people lost their jobs. They were just let go unexpectedly. And that's where this idea came in. So what control meant, some people just get bogged down, and they wanted to just attack the corporation that let them go, or sue them, or focused on things that were beyond their immediate world. And they did not do well. Whereas others said, okay, this is pretty bad. I've lost my job. Where do I go from here? What can I do? And one person said, well, I love baking. I've always wanted to open a bakery. Or, maybe it's time to really clean up my resume and move somewhere else. So there are things in our lives, and they may be small things that we have control over. I think it's really important to realize that there's always something in our life, whether it's how we think, it's our attitude, that we can change, that we can control. And being able to do that can lead to major, major improvements down the road. So I think that's what it involves, focusing on the little things that we can do that can take us forward.
That is super helpful, Steve. So I noticed earlier a question on this topic of hardiness, and our listeners are wondering how we can differentiate hardiness from resilience.
So the way I like to think about it, we all go through tough times. We all go through challenges and difficulties. And for some of us, it's a matter of, okay, eventually I'll get through this, I'll get over it, and I'll go back to where I was. What we found is that by developing a hardy mindset, it's not just about bouncing back, it's about being stronger. And I'm sure you've experienced people who have benefited, and we document some in the book, people who have gone through really difficult times. I think we document even some famous people, some performers who've gone through tough times in their lives, like terrible experiences, but they come back stronger. They don't just bounce back to where they were before the bad event. And how do they do that? What is the thought process? What is the change, or what leads to that change to make them stronger? And that's where we see hardiness differentiating from just plain resilience.
Wow, that is really insightful. So the idea would be, if I'm resilient, I bounce back to where I was. If I have hardiness, I grow beyond as a result of facing challenges. Um,
Exactly.
I'm seeing a follow-up question though on the topic of things that are inside our control and outside that I want to address before we move on to talk about emotional intelligence. Um, Judith is, I guess this is a comment related to the idea of control, uses the question, what choices are available? What can I choose to do right now? Which helps her to claim agency in tough situations. Um, and while we're still on the hardiness topic, my friend Caroline, who's on the call from Germany, is asking, is hardiness more similar to post-traumatic growth?
There probably are some overlaps with post-traumatic growth, but again, we're a bit more specific in defining what are and in this case, the three C's, the three areas that can proactively help you get there. When we talk about post-traumatic growth, it's kind of it's more like we hope you're going to get there, but there's no real roadmap to help you, and hopefully this provides a bit of a roadmap to facilitate that process.
So challenge and control and commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So, in Emotional Intelligence for Dummies, you talk about the fact that emotional intelligence is a skill that can be learned. So, I was hoping that we could dive in on this topic of emotional intelligence and talk about where to start if we want to increase or improve our emotional intelligence.
That's a good question. Well, the first thing is to become aware of your own emotional intelligence. Where do you stand? What are your strengths? And I mean, a lot of you have said that you already are pretty familiar with it. But just to sort of put us on the same playing field, there are several. When we started, there was only one or two definitions of emotional intelligence. It's now grown to a number of them. But what the different definitions have in common are basically three things. One is the ability to be aware of your own emotions and others. The second is the ability to manage your own and or other people's emotions. And the third we see is the ability to sort of use emotions to get things done, to perform, to achieve certain results. So those three things are pretty common to all the different definitions of emotional intelligence. The definition we use goes a little bit further in the EQI 2.0 emotional intelligence quotient inventory, but where you start is really trying to get a handle on your own what are your strengths, what are your challenges, to learn more about where you score in these areas, and that helps you in terms of development, because some people like to capitalize on their strengths, and other people like to shore up some of their challenges or weakness areas.
So that's really helpful to think about the three levels of building awareness first, and then um, let's see, the second one,
Is
I'm like
managing emotions,
manage, and then using our
and then using
emotions.
them to motivate yourself to do various things.
Do you have any story about that?
Story, lots of stories. Well, it's I mean, it's amazing how many people have reported that, learning about emotional intelligence has really changed their lives. And one of the things we've learned is that people tend to think they're kind of fixed in their life. They're either had scored an average or low IQ, or like school wasn't their thing, but they seem to be good at certain other things. They seem to know where the best parties were. They seem to have a lot of friends who came to check them out. They seem to be in on all the information that nobody else had. So once they learn that, these are a different set of skills, it's very separate from your ability to learn math or to memorize history. These are interpersonal skills. These are learning about yourself and how you interact with other people. And once people have learned, I've had many cases where people understand this, they get to use it and say, oh, so I'm okay. So there are things I can do. So I can be successful in life, even though, I graduated with a 3.0 average, or I never made it to college. I always felt I was stupid because I never made it to college. But yet, I'm a very popular person, or I have the right information when I need it, or I know how to get people to do what I want them to do. They have these other sort of subtle skills. So once you put a name to it, you talk to them about it, you explain to them, how to use it, how to be even better at using it and aware of it, it changes their lives.
Thank you for that, Steve. So let's talk about the benefits of improving our emotional intelligence when it comes to how we show up in the workplace. So, are there some practices that organizations can put in place so that collectively in our organizations we can leverage our emotional intelligence more effectively?
Yes, it is an area we spent many years looking at. And what's really important if you're going to implement it within an organization is that you do get buy-in from the top of the organization. Sometimes we've worked with HR people who try and get some initiatives going, but when the senior members of the organization think, "Oh, this is a bunch of garbage. We don't need to spend time on this," it's not really going to do well because people look to the top of the organization often in terms of seeing, how they should behave or what they should do. So it's got to really be built into the DNA of the organization. So where to start is with the top. And one of the ways that we found that is useful, I don't want to just plug my own book, but often for the HR person to plop one of the books on emotional intelligence in front of the CEO and say, well, why don't you look at this? Especially when it's a book that has data about organizations that perform better when their people are high in emotional intelligence, it tends to get their attention if they're open to a certain degree, open minded. So once you've got that, then it's a matter of starting with that senior team and getting them to understand why it's important, even in their own relations with each other, when they don't agree on things or when things get tough. Why would this be important? I spent a lot of time working with people on boards of directors. So I even start at that level, like even higher than the CEO, where we teach the importance of emotional intelligence, even at board meetings, and transferring that down the line. Yeah, so at that point, they're selecting CEOs that are high on EI, or at least able to benefit from training in EI. And then we work our way through the organization. And it's always good to start with people who have an interest in this area, because you're always going to find some naysayers who say, I don't need this. I'm a genius already, right? So so you work your way through the willing, and usually it catches on. People say, wow, this is great. I mean, Jill's a lot better, happier dealing with her now. I don't get into arguments or disagreements. We can come to compromises on things, and so on and so forth.
So, at what point would you recommend that an organization implement the assessments to be able to see where their team is with emotional intelligence?
Well, I think once they're ready for it, because it's always good to give the assessments to people who are really interested and going to be honest about it, because you don't want people who are just going to do it because they're forced to do it. That's never a good thing. So you want to really spark people's interest, and there are a lot of stories. Some of them are in the book, the Dummies book, where you sort of share these stories and say, "Well, look what happened here," or "Look how this affected that person," and then people are more willing to explore this thing, if they're hopefully open minded enough and want to improve themselves, or even improve the atmosphere or what's going on in their organization.
Got it. So, you want to make sure that there's a willingness and openness to the ideas before you invest in assessments so that you have people's wholehearted participation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
A great comment here from one of our attendees, Judith, who says that the organization that she works in has emotional intelligence as a core value. And their organization says we are committed to improving outcomes by being aware of our emotions and their impact on others and regulating them to foster positive and productive working relationships. Right on,
Great. That sounds like a great organization, Judith.
for sure. So, I want to talk about the two books together because we are focused on both of them in today's event. And in both of the books, you talk about purpose and how finding purpose in personal and professional settings can increase both your hardiness and your emotional intelligence. So, could you expand a little bit on this important area of purpose?
Yeah, we sort of come at it slightly different ways in the two books. I mean, in Hardiness, as I mentioned, we talk about commitment, and there's a whole section on how you build commitment, how you find that thing in your life that really guides you, or a direction that you want to move towards. Now, emotional intelligence, and this kind of differentiates the two concepts. Hardiness is more of a built-in kind of, think of it as a core value or personality aspect that you have. It's the way you approach the world. And emotional, it's sort of the lens you use when moving forward. Whereas emotional intelligence are the set of skills that go on top of that, that overlay over that. So these are skills that are much easier to sort of train and learn how to adapt to. So when we talk about purpose in emotional intelligence, we have one factor in there, which is self-actualization. And what that involves is, so once you've established what your purpose is using hardiness, you go to self-actualization in the emotional intelligence realm, and that's about learning more. How do I get better at this? Let's say in one of the tennis players we work with, her goal was to win the U.S. Open, right? So that's a commitment. That's a goal. That's something you're going to work toward. Self-actualization is sort of setting the path to get there. What do I have to do? How often do I have to practice? Where do I learn new techniques from? Who do I get coaching from? It's kind of the active ingredients of moving forward. We call that self-actualization, one of the 15 components of emotional intelligence.
Thank you for that, Steve. I want to take just a quick moment for everyone to let you know about how you can learn more about these two books. And then we're going to take some of the questions that have been coming into the chat. There have been some really great ones that we want to be able to tackle together. But for those of you who are intrigued, as I am, by this work, we want to let you know that both the Hardiness book and Steve's other newly released Emotional Intelligence for Dummies book are available at all the online retailers that you might choose to shop at. And we would encourage you today to buy one or more copies for yourself, your friends, and your colleagues. Potentially these are books that you could bring into your organization to study with your colleagues. If you have already read and benefited from these books or any of Steve's other books, an Amazon review is always a helpful way to let others know that the book is worth investing their time and energy in. So we would encourage you to leave an honest review on Goodreads or on Amazon to help other readers discover this work. Of course, your social media channels are always a great place to let others know about what you're reading so that they can discover these books and topics. And if you're willing to share these books through any other content marketing efforts you might be doing through your newsletter, through an email or a blog. Finally, we want to invite you, if you're interested in learning more from Steve after this session, to check out his podcast, Work Therapy When Work Sucks, How Can We Fix It, which is in its second season. And we would invite you to listen to that everywhere you can find your favorite podcasts. And I know Wendy, my colleague who's here helping out today, is putting all the links to all of those items in the chat. So I'm really thrilled now to be able to ask some of the questions that have come in during our conversation, Steve. I want to start with a question from Paul, and he was wondering how you landed on the term hardiness.
Well, it wasn't me. so that was Paul's group at University of Chicago. As I mentioned, they started off doing this research studying stress in executives, and when some of the subjects in their study lost their jobs, were suddenly let go, it was a telecom merger. Um, what happened was, as I mentioned, some of these people kind of fell apart, didn't know what to do, and others really bounced back. So they sort of came up with the term hardiness at that time because of this sort of not just bouncing back, but people who were able to get ahead of themselves. They I guess they took it from the idea of certain flowers that stay strong regardless of the weather outside, and that term hardiness just stuck.
Thank you for that. Let's see. So Caroline is wanting to understand more clearly the differentiation between hardiness and EQ. And so she says hardiness is closer to personality and EQ are the more trainable skills. Is that correct? And could you please expand a little more about the relationship between hardiness and EQ?
Sure. I think that's a good way to sort of put it. You know, I see that we have our core values, the things that are, you know, deep within our gut that we believe strongly in. And I see it as sort of semicircles coming out, you know, as we get further and closer to our surface. So next to our core values are our personality characteristics. And again, these are things that remain pretty constant throughout our lives when they've done longitudinal studies of personality. And hardiness comes somewhere kind of on the fringe, on the outskirts of that, because it is changeable, but it is a lens that we use in approaching our lives. When something happens, we automatically have this, I'll call it a mindset, a way of perceiving things that happen to us. Right away, is this good for me or bad for me? And if it's bad for me, where do I go from there? So it's kind of a way that we approach the world. Then when we go to the next layer outside of that, I think we get to the emotional skills, the skills that we have or don't have to deal with it, our ability to be assertive, our ability to be empathic, to listen to what the other person is saying, our ability to problem solve. Like all of these emotional skills are the next layer. And then out in front of that are maybe things like our technical skills. Maybe we're a carpenter or a plumber or a lawyer or whatever. That level goes in front in terms of how we approach the world. And that's sort of how I see it, as different levels and different ways of helping us approach the world around us.
So I'm wondering about the person who's on the call today who may feel that they're facing some stress either in their workplace or in their personal life, and they're listening to what you're sharing and assessing that potentially they're low in this hardiness quotient or this hardiness ability. Do you have any specific, like, kind of first step suggestions for someone who wants to be able to think about their challenges differently and build their hardiness, like, even in this moment? Like, is it something where we can just decide, like, hey, I can see that I'm not displaying hardiness as I approach X stressor in my life. And so I want to. And so is that something that we can just turn on and turn off?
It's a challenge, but I think there is some research showing that you can kind of do that. Some research I cite in the book by Elisa Klum, who's at Stanford University, showed that people were able to quickly switch the way they view situations in a pretty dramatic way. But just I'll give you a few examples of things you could do. In terms of commitment, if you just start thinking in your own life, what are the things are most important to you, or the goals or the things you most want to achieve in life? And what happens is when we get bumps in the road, when things aren't going well for us, we get in an argument with someone, we tend to lose track of those things. So it really is a matter of how do you bring yourself back to what are the most important things in my life? What are the things I really want to accomplish? That these little spats or whatever will be forgotten in a year or two. They won't be important to me. So that's just commitment. So within each of these areas, we have some suggestions or little things you could do to start making that change. In control, it's about, again, something terrible happened. What am I going to do? Am I going to try and push for the world to change? No, you're not going to really change the world, not quickly in any event. What can I do myself? What can I do to make myself feel better right now? Put myself in a better mood so that I can better deal with those issues later on. So and again, there's a whole bunch of tactics that we give you that you can kind of switch quickly into different mindset so that you're better able to approach the world. You know, being sad and upset, it doesn't have a huge purpose. I mean, the main purpose may be to motivate you to change directions, to say, okay, something's not right here. What can I do to move on or move in a different direction? And it's about using those emotions to help you, not to hinder you.
Sure. I'm curious, Steve. I hope I can ask this question, but has there been a time on your own journey that you've needed to tap into these three facets of hardiness, into commitment and control and challenge? Would you be
Yeah, I
willing
think
to share?
there's a lot of, it's part of being human, right? There are things that go wrong. There are challenges, that happen with certain people or certain situations. Things don't go the way you wanted in a certain respect. So yeah, so I do sit back and think about it and say, how can I look at this? What can I learn from this? Early on, as you know, starting a business, when you're small and starting, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, one time I remember we were quite small, and the bank decided they didn't want to deal with us anymore, right? And we were almost gonna we were almost gonna lose it because they didn't think we had a future. They didn't think whatever psychological testing was of any value. Who's gonna want this thing? So it was pretty drastic, and we had to make some really tough decisions and to shift things around to survive. But I could have said, okay, maybe the bank's right. I mean, I'm not a business person, I'm a psychologist. So yeah, maybe they know more than I do, and maybe I'm wasting my time trying to start a business of assessments. Fortunately, I didn't think that way. I thought differently. We thought of alternate sources to help us get through the tough times. And as you can see, it's become pretty successful. So we all have challenges in life. We all have to sort of step back, evaluate the situation, and find the path that works for us, the one that we feel good with personally. And I think that way you'll be a lot happier.
So it sounds like your commitment and understanding what was most important to you about the business that you were building was something that empowered you to be hardy in those moments of facing challenge with the financing of the business.
Absolutely. Commitment was a part of it. Control. I mean, I couldn't control them. And no matter how much I talked to them, they wouldn't change their mind. So I had to control what I had to work with, and where I could take that to an alternate source. And the challenge was important too, because I had to see this as, okay, this is an interesting situation. What are some options? What are some alternative things I could do? So I didn't just wallow in my depression. I used it as a sense of challenge to actually step back. I mean, it could have been devastating. I had a young family and, whatever. So using those, and again, I didn't know about hardiness at that time. I'm sort of backtracking the kind of thought processes I went through. Unfortunately, that's why this sort of resonates to me so well. When Paul and I got together and I learned more about the work he's been doing, I could see how this would apply in so many situations.
Wonderful, thank you. So there's a couple more questions about hardiness that have come in. The first one is from Ken, and he's wondering, can we apply the hardiness concept to seniors people? Can it be effective for people who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s? And Steve, I want to ask you if you could just move back a little bit from your mic. We're getting a little bit of tinniness from you. It was better when you were a little bit back.
Okay. Wow. Senior people, 60s. Makes me feel old. More beyond that. Yeah, hardiness, there's no age limit to hardiness. We find that it works throughout the spectrum of age. We've looked at people, I've had experienced people in their 90s, actually. My mother lived to 100. So, I found a lot of these concepts valuable for her and people in that age range. I know for some senior family members, especially when they live that long, they lose a lot of their friends and people they knew, and it becomes a lonelier time for them. But using these concepts was able to say, what can I control? Well, I can make new friends, or sort of not getting into a depression over just some of the things that go along with living a longer life.
Thank you for that. We have a question related to whether or not there are cultural differences with hardiness, and are some nationalities or countries hardy by nature? For example, this listener says Finnish culture has a concept called sisu. I hope I'm saying that correctly, perseverance as part of their national identity. And there was another listener who's like wanting also for you to comment on that if you're aware of that concept of sisu, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, actually, I did hear about that, and some of the research on hardiness, I think, has been done with the Finnish military. So that's how we were kind of exposed to that. I don't have a real comprehensive international scope on. We do on emotional intelligence, and in I don't think it's this book, actually. It's one of my other books. I think it's either the EQ Edge or EQ Leader, where we actually document the different cultures and emotional intelligence scores, how it's different in Asia versus Africa versus Australia versus North America and Europe. So we have done that work with emotional intelligence. I think we will be doing that work soon with hardiness. We have a huge database of people who've taken our hardiness tool, the hardiness resilience gauge. And I think in time, I think it's a great question. And I think we will work on looking at international differences on hardiness and what influence that has in terms of what happens in a specific country.
Well, so even though it's not represented in one of the books that we're talking about today, since we're on the topic, would you want to share with us a little bit about what you see around the world as it relates to the scores on emotional intelligence?
Yeah, well, some of it, you might expect, like in Asian countries and Asian societies, assertiveness tends to be down. It's not as socially acceptable to always state your mind, what you think and feel about things. Whereas in other countries like in Scandinavia, people are more assertive, or in parts of Europe where if you go to work there, and the context that we deliver this in is people who are moving from one country to another to a different workplace, learning that culture. Because if you are, many Americans are pretty assertive about what they want and expect, and that sometimes doesn't go over well in an Asian society, Asian company. So you want to prepare yourself, and you've lived in Asia, so Becky, that you have to prepare yourself for being in that country. So assertiveness is one that changes a lot. Emotional self-awareness changes a lot. Some countries are more meditative, think more about their own thoughts and feelings, whereas other countries we know ignore those thoughts and feelings and just burst ahead with what they think of other people. So yeah, there are. I think we have a nice little documentation of each of the 15 emotional intelligence skills and how they change in a variety of these different cultures.
And for those who want to learn more, that's in your EQ Edge book.
EQ Edge or EQ Leader? Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. Just one of those
Yeah,
two.
no worries. I think the answer is we just need to buy and read the entire back list of Dr. Steven Stein. Is that right?
That would be nice.
All right. This is a good moment actually to read a note that came into the chat about the impact of this work. It came from Marlene Smeckens. I hope I'm saying that correctly. She's sharing with those who are on the call. 25 years ago, we started with EI in Belgium. Most people did not understand why we specialized in EI for our executive search business, but some did. Bit by bit, we grew in EI. EI and the EQ changed my personal life. EQI, I think, changed my personal life and our business. Now, for many years already, EI and EQI is daily activity business. Dr. Steven Stein and we in Belgium made the right choice 25 years ago to go for EI. It makes the world a better place. So
Thank
that
you
is such
very
a
much.
heartwarming comment. Thank you, Marlene, for that.
Mhm.
Uh, for those of you who are curious about implementing more of these ideas before we wrap the hour, and we have some closing comments coming soon from Dr. Stein, I do want to remind you that all the backlist, not just the two that we're focused on today, are available on Amazon. And I would encourage you to check out all of Dr. Stein's backlist of his depth of research and contribution on the topic of emotional intelligence and on the topic of hardiness. And in any way that you want to help us in building more awareness of this work with others who might benefit from it, we would welcome that, including Amazon reviews and social sharing. And again, for those who might want to learn more from Steve with his latest thinking, you can listen to the new season of the Work Therapy podcast. So we're going to put all of those links into the chat for you as well. I might have time. I know there are a few more questions that we haven't gotten to yet. So I'm going to take a couple more, Steve, and then we will kick it back to you for some closing thoughts. So I had a question, a follow-up actually from Ken, who's wondering how hardiness works well in a multi-generational workplace, or how you could apply this concept in a multi-generational workplace.
Good question. I guess really trying to find common ground among the different, groups, the different cohorts. One is just exploring with each of the different cohort. What's your future? Where do you want to be? We all might be looking for different things. The younger person, and what we find with a lot of the younger cohorts is their future is in learning. They really want an organization or a place where they can learn and adapt and get new skills. Whereas a more senior cohort may have different things in mind. They may be thinking about retirement or other things they can do, or where they go from there. So I think the first thing would be to explore the commitment level where people are at, and if they understand each other, it makes it easier to get along with the other person if you know where they're coming from or what their future goals are. You can even feed into them. You can help the young person by saying, "Oh, here's an opportunity where you can learn something new," or maybe you can set up some kind of coaching or mentoring system in that world. Control is also important. We find there may be differences in the age levels. Sometimes young people have all kinds of vinegar and whatever in them, and they think they can do everything. But you may want to temper that a bit and saying, look, here's the most important things for you to be in charge of or to control right now. And we'll get to these other things maybe later. And again, of course, challenge can be looked at across the cohorts and see how they approach solving problems. Do they approach it in a similar way or do they approach it differently? And how do they look at what is a problem? How do they define problems? So there's a number of things you could do in a multi-cohort or organization.
Well, it seems like it might start with having some shared language and potentially like a book study or a presentation on the topic could give people some shared vocabulary to get to know each other well and interact on these topics.
Absolutely, that always makes it easier.
So another question about emotional intelligence, Steve. How does emotional intelligence temper negative feelings that can arise? So can an emotionally intelligent person still feel anger and have adverse reactions to change?
Okay, so these emotions are natural. We're going to get angry, and it's not about stopping your anger or preventing your anger. You're going to feel the anger. The question is, how do you deal with it? How do you manage that when it happens? Is that going to motivate you to something positive, or are you just going to, lose it? Your impulse control is going to be shot, and you're going to throw something or hit someone or whatever. So it's really more about how are we going to deal with these emotions that sometimes they're called negative emotions or unpleasant emotions. It's not going to cure them. It's not going to make them go away, but it's maybe going to make you think about, okay, what can I do from here? How can I get through this? How can I manage this? And these emotional skills are tools to help you do that. Maybe I got to be more assertive. Maybe I got to go speak to somebody about something that's bothering me. Maybe that'll help me. Or maybe I've got to be more empathic. I got to listen to where that other person is coming from before I react or do something. So, again, these are tools to help you manage those rough oceans, those rough emotions that we're all going to experience.
Yes, and maybe multiple emotions in a day. My friend Tessie is asking, can you please speak to mental health resilience and hardiness? She's calling from the UK, and in the UK, the suicide levels for young men 19 to 24 is high and got worse since COVID-19. So, any suggestions about applying these concepts in order to address current mental health crises in our world?
Yeah, so we actually did some research looking at mental health issues correlated with hardiness, and there is a direct relationship. Uh, Again, the simplest or one way to start would be in the area of commitment. I mean, people need purpose in their lives. They need something to live for. In the case of suicide cases, those people often have given up hope. They figure, I'm a burden to my family or to society. Why should I go on? And I think here it's a matter of working with people, teaching them that. And we have examples in the book of people in the worst of situations, prisoners of war. There's nothing that we could find really worse than being a prisoner of war. You could be tortured, you could be beaten. And we have examples of people who've gone through that experience and studies of people who've gone through that experience, showing how these concepts can help keep them alive and get them through it. The fact that they did find purpose in their lives, and again, it could be a variety of things. It might be a religious purpose, it might be some spiritual thing, it might be some family thing. It's something. We all have something that keeps us going, that motivates us, that we look forward to in the future. And it's a matter of exploring and really working with that person, letting them know that they are worthwhile, they do have a purpose, and let's figure out what that purpose is. And I think that's one of the handles that can help deal with people who feel that life isn't worth living anymore. Why bother? So yeah, I think there's a good relationship there.
Yeah, that's a really helpful reflection on bringing people back to those things that matter most to them and reminding them that they're worthy and worthwhile. And a comment in the chat that these insights are pivotal. So thank you for those powerful reminders to all of us today about the value of understanding and holding on to our commitments. I did see a question earlier related to hardiness and grit. So, grit is another word that gets thrown around. So, do you have any feelings or reflections on the difference between those two terms, hardiness and grit?
Absolutely. Glad that you asked that. That's a great question. Yeah, so grit somehow got a lot more popularity than hardiness did. I won't go into the reasons why, but here's the difference. Grit is really just about, putting your head down and plowing ahead, no matter what the consequence. So let's say, let's talk about music. I'm a musician. I'm a saxophone player. I want to be John Coltrane. And I'm going to dedicate my life to being John Coltrane, to play as good as him. There's no way in the world that I'm going to ever be John Coltrane. I'd be wasting my time and just messing up my life if I put my head down and that's all I ever wanted to do. So hardiness differs from that. When we talk about challenge, it's about knowing when you've reached your limit and it's time to change. Maybe instead of being a famous performer, I could be a teacher of music, or I could be a studio musician, or there's many other directions that I can go rather than using grit and putting my head down. Two studies I think we cite in our book on grit. One of them was done with gamblers in Las Vegas. The people who are higher in grit, score higher in grit, tend to lose a lot more money on the slot machines and on the tables.
Hmm.
And the second study that we cited, which was kind of interesting, was on mountain climbers. Mountain climbers who are higher in grit are more likely to die mountain climbing because they don't give up. They just keep going. Our research on hardiness with athletes shows that athletes that are higher in hardiness are the ones who, when they have an injury, they know to stop and to heal themselves, as opposed to pushing themselves to the point of no return.
Wow, that's a really helpful insight, Steve. And it reminded me of this movie I watched on Netflix. Since you're a musician, maybe you watched it too. It's called Whiplash.
Yes,
It's about a drummer. I think he was displaying grit when he drummed until his fingers were like dripping with blood, which
absolutely.
probably wasn't a display of hardiness in that moment. Yeah.
That was pretty tough. Yes,
Powerful
absolutely.
movie. All right. Well, Steve, I know that you prepared a few closing thoughts for us as we come to the end of this hour together.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just share with you, one of the many reasons I find this work so interesting and valuable, because I think we tap on some very basic human dimensions. And I've been talking about this in places all around the world. Probably one of the more interesting ones was dealing with Cree natives up in northern Manitoba, when we talked about emotional intelligence, and they came back to me and said, this is not new. This is our medicine wheel. And then they showed me their medicine wheel that they've used for centuries, outlining some of the same things that we talk about in emotional intelligence. So what we're dealing with here are universal. For all human beings, we share a lot of these same values and these what we call skills in emotional intelligence. We all want to work together in a social group. We all want to understand each other. We want to be assertive. We want to solve problems. We want to manage stress. These are shared values that I find in countries all over the world, and that's why I guess this concept has caught on. So and I'm excited that we have so many people here from different countries, from Asia and from Europe, and from some other places, I'm sure as well. So that's I guess my main message is what we're dealing with are universal topics. There's nothing magical or mystical about them. They're things that we probably identified for hundreds of years. We just put a different name to it. We've done some research behind it. We've tried to fine tune it. We've tried to find ways in which you can improve it and work with it. And that's really what it's all about. It's sometimes we say there's very simple things. Someone said to me once, "You make a living talking about people, things like that." I mean, that's so basic. But yeah, that's we feel that it's not only basic, but it's important, and we often lose sight of the importance of these very sort of basic skills. And I guess that's my message, that we can all benefit from these skills.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you to all who have invested in this hour with us.